There's this massive patch of the North Atlantic Ocean that has completely captured the world's imagination like nowhere else on Earth. You know the stories. It's a place where compasses supposedly spin wildly out of control, where the sky merges with the sea, and where massive ships and aircraft just vanish, literally without a trace. Welcome to our ultimate explainer on the Bermuda Triangle. Today, we're tearing right through the veil of this modern myth. We're going to look at the chilling disappearances, the wild supernatural theories, and most importantly, we'll dig into the hard scientific data that actually solves this decades-old maritime mystery. Now, to really understand why this legend has such a vice grip on our collective psyche, we first have to respect the sheer scale of the danger out there. Marine biologists and wreck custodians operating in this region estimate that these crystal clear waters may have claimed up to 300 vessels. I mean, think about that for a second. That is an astonishing underwater graveyard of iron, wood, and human ambition, completely encircling the islands. And this physical reality is the very foundation of the mystery. As marine biologist Philippe Rouger observed while documenting these wrecks, there's clearly something out there that poses a deadly threat to shipping. See, this isn't just folklore. It's a physical reality written in shattered holes across the ocean floor. But to figure out what that deadly threat actually is, we really need to look at how this whole story began in the first place. Which brings us to Chapter 1, Birth of a Legend, Constructing a Modern Maritime Myth. Here's the thing about the Bermuda Triangle. It wasn't some ancient mariner's curse. It was actually born right in the middle of 20th century media. The whole thing started in 1950 when Edward Van Winkle Jones reported on some unusual disappearances for the Associated Press. The fire was stoked a couple of years later in 1952 when George X. Sand wrote in Fate magazine and laid out a specific triangular area of losses. But the myth was truly cemented in 1964. That's when Vincent Gaddis, writing for Argosy magazine, finally gave it the name that would haunt the public for decades, the deadly Bermuda Triangle. What's truly fascinating, though, is how flexible this history was right from the start. The vertices were initially firmly listed as Miami, San Juan, and Bermuda, but as different authors started chasing bestseller status, they constantly expanded those boundaries just to include more and more shipwrecks. The total area ballooned, eventually spanning anywhere from 1.3 to 3.9 million square kilometers. Some writers even pushed the edges as far as the coast of Ireland. And, well, with a net that massive, attributing totally unrelated accidents to one single sinister force becomes incredibly easy. Let's move to Chapter 2, Disappearances in the Deep, When the Ocean Swallows Ships Whole. Take the Mary Celestia, for example. She was a heavy, iron-hulled Civil War steamship, and what makes her demise so incredibly unsettling is that she sank just 800 meters from the shore of Bermuda on a flat, perfectly calm day. When seemingly secure ships go down in clear weather, literally a stone's throw from land, you can absolutely see how rumors of an invisible, mysterious force start to take root. But the absolute cornerstone of the Triangle legends, that has to be the 1945 disappearance of Flight 19. This was a squadron of 5 U.S. Navy torpedo bombers. The eerie radio transmissions from the flight leader still send chills right down the spine. He said, "We cannot be sure of any direction. Everything is wrong, strange. The ocean doesn't look as it should." The entire squadron just vanished. And tragically, a 13-man search and rescue plane that deployed to find them exploded and disappeared too. Then there's the massive human toll. 306. That's the number of crewmen who vanished without a single trace back in 1918 aboard the USS Cyclops. She was a massive naval collier carrying heavy manganese ore, and she simply ceased to exist somewhere north of the West Indies. To this day, it remains the U.S. Navy's single largest loss of life not related to combat. There was no distress call, no wreckage, just gone. That leads us into Chapter 3, The Supernatural Suspects. Searching for answers in the paranormal. So, with ships and planes seemingly disappearing into thin air, that void of evidence was quickly filled by some incredibly sensational theories. I mean, human imagination just ran wild. Authors like Charles Berlitz championed these totally out-of-this-world concepts. Theories ranged from leftover crystal technology from the mythical lost city of Atlantis, which people often connected to the submerged Bimini Road formation, to literal tears in the fabric of reality, creating this time and space warp that sucked ships into a parallel universe. Others went straight to the stars, blaming extraterrestrial abductions and UFOs. It made for phenomenal book sales, for sure, but how much of it was actually true? Let's find out in Chapter 4, Science of the Sea. the investigative reality behind the myth. This is where we execute a hard pivot away from science fiction and look at rigorous scientific fact. The real turning point was a confrontation between sensationalism and actual investigation. In 1975, a researcher named Larry Kush published a book that practically dismantled the myth overnight. Where Charles Berlitz claimed missing ships vanished in calm Atlantic waters, Kush actually dug up the meteorology records, proving there were massive, undocumented storms at those exact times. Kush even proved that one ore carrier Berlitz claimed vanished in the Atlantic actually sank in the Pacific Ocean. The mystery, it turned out, was heavily manufactured by sloppy research and totally ignored weather data. But what about the raw numbers? Surely more ships sink here than elsewhere, right? Well, actually no. When the U.S. Coast Guard and the massive marine insurance market Lloyd's of London analyzed the actual data, they found something remarkably normal. The number of disappearances in the Bermuda Triangle is statistically insignificant. When you factor in the massive volume of shipping and flight traffic passing through this area every single day, the accident rate is exactly the same as any other busy part of the global ocean. In fact, Lloyd's of London doesn't even charge higher insurance rates to sail through it. And modern science is still actively solving these cold cases today. Take the SS Cotopaxi. This ship vanished in 1925 and became so famous as a paranormal victim that it was literally featured in the classic sci-fi movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind. But in 2020, marine biologists finally identified a wreck off the coast of St. Augustine, Florida, as the Cotopaxi. Turns out, she wasn't abducted by aliens. She had actually sent out distress signals while taking on water during a documented tropical storm. Time and time again, historical science replaces these paranormal myths with a much more tragic reality. Which brings us to Chapter 5, the real culprit, the true dangers of the North Atlantic. So, if there are no aliens or Atlantean crystals, what is the deadly threat lurking off the coast? It ultimately comes down to a highly active, highly volatile natural environment. First up, you have the Gulf Stream. This is practically a rapid river flowing within the ocean, moving at 2 meters per second. If a small plane ditches, this current will rapidly sweep the debris miles away, making it look like it just vanished without a trace. Next, you have compass variations. The triangle is one of the few places on Earth where magnetic north and true north differ, which can easily confuse an unprepared navigator. And finally, violent weather. This area is an absolute highway for devastating Atlantic hurricanes and unpredictable microbursts, which are basically literal bombs of cold air that drop from the sky at 90 miles per hour, completely capable of flipping a ship instantly. And then there's a genuinely terrifying scientific theory that honestly sounds a bit like sci-fi, but is entirely natural. We're talking about methane hydrates. This is a form of natural gas found in massive fields trapped right beneath the continental shelves of the ocean. And here's how this brilliantly illustrates nature being far more frightening than a ghost story. It starts when submarine mud volcanoes erupt on the seafloor. This releases massive plumes of methane gas bubbles that rise rapidly to the surface, creating vast regions of frothy, churning water. Now, because the water is suddenly saturated with gas, the density of the ocean drastically decreases. Any ship unfortunate enough to be caught in this froth instantly loses its buoyancy. It just drops like a stone to the ocean floor without a single moment's warning. The wreckage is then quickly swept away by that fast-moving Gulf Stream. But above the Gulf Stream, above the storms and the submarine mud volcanoes, the ultimate culprit is actually far closer to home. Human error remains the most cited official cause for wrecks in this region. We have documented cases like the 2017 MU-2B aircraft crash, where pilots intentionally flew directly into severe 40,000-foot thunderstorms. We have countless accounts of sailors stubbornly navigating right into the teeth of heavy gales against all advice. And in the tragic case of Flight 19 that we talked about earlier, severe navigational confusion simply led to them running out of fuel and ditching into rough seas. Immense natural forces, when combined with simple human mistakes, are just an incredibly deadly combination. Which brings us to a final, really provocative thought. As we've seen throughout this explainer, the true story of the Bermuda Triangle is one of sensational journalism, unpredictable weather, and tragic human error. Yet the myth absolutely persists today. So you have to ask yourself, why does human psychology prefer the thrill of a paranormal mystery over the tragic, statistically normal reality of human error and nature's fury? Perhaps the idea of a cursed ocean is simply easier for us to accept than the stark, unforgiving reality of the sea. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and remember to always keep questioning the world around you.